I don't know if your knowledge of technology stretches to this, but there are dozens of applications that you can get for your phone, your mobile phone, or your computer that will give you a verse for the day. You know the kind of thing, you wake up in the morning and they'll give you an alert to say, here's a verse to dwell on today, almost like a Christian version of horoscopes, I suppose, like a biblical version of that sort of thing, a thought for the day, a verse for the day. And if phone applications are a step too far, and you have calendars and diaries or wall charts that do a similar thing, well, you've probably seen that verse for the day. I wonder how many years it would take you subscribing to verses for the day until you reached Luke 16:9. I dare say there are many companies that produce these that would have probably never in their history had Luke 16:9 as the verse for the day, which says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This is in a way Jesus' punchline to the parable of the shrewd manager that we read in Luke 16. The parable itself is as difficult as that concluding statement makes it sound. I looked at several commentators to gauge what they had to say on this parable, and I noticed that they all started in a similar way. And I'll read you the opening sentences of 6 different commentators on this passage. Okay, these are genuinely the opening statements. This is from William Barclay, who is a rather liberal in some areas, but says this is a difficult parable to interpret. Another one, Leon Morris, says, this is notoriously one of the most difficult of all the parables to interpret. Another, Craig Evans, says, few of the parables of Jesus have puzzled readers of the Gospels more than this one. The lesser-known commentator Michael Wilcox says, the pair of parables which constitute Luke 16 bristle with problems. Darrell Bock says this is probably the most difficult parable in Luke. And Craig Blomberg, who writes a commentary on the Bible's use of money and possessions, says this parable is arguably the most perplexing of all that Jesus told. It is an exegetical hornet's nest. Okay? In other words, the commentators, while they may disagree and have different opinions on exactly what's going on in the parable and how we're to understand it, one thing they are united on is that we are in for a difficult evening. Okay? So keep our thoughts to hopefully half an hour, and we'll see how we get on. And if you want to give me some feedback or some pushback on some of the things here and raise extra avenues of what might possibly be going on here, then that might be helpful for discussion afterwards. Well, why is this parable difficult? Let me raise the issues for you in case you think it's really easy and you understood it perfectly well. Here's where some of the difficult areas come into play. Firstly, some parables are difficult because it's hard to know what the characters in the parable represent. Who's this representing? Who's that representing? Some parables are difficult because no interpretation is given, and therefore it's hard to understand exactly for certain what Jesus meant. But here we're essentially told what the parable means. It's not difficult because it's unclear necessarily. It's difficult because the seemingly clear message of the parable is a strange message for Jesus to give. Why does Jesus tell us to use our wealth to gain friends for ourselves? Why is he telling us that? What does he mean by that? What does that look like? And how does gaining friends with our wealth result in us being welcomed into eternal dwellings? Okay, so also on top of that, it's not easy to understand how Jesus' conclusion fits with the parable. So after the parable, you have several statements about money, our use of money, being trusted with money, and worldly possessions. And it's not easy to work out how it fits on and how to join the dots between all these different sections and statements. In fact, some people have concluded that perhaps Luke is simply just adding on several selected statements about money that Jesus preached over a number of years and just sort of bunged them on the end because it kind of fit with the rest of the passage. I don't think that's the case. But I think the best thing to do is to go through the passage. Another area of difficulty, and perhaps the biggest area of difficulty here, is why does Jesus commend a dishonest manager? So you've got here that the manager, the steward of the man's household, is dishonest with what happens, and he's commended for his dishonesty. Why is Jesus applauding dishonest behaviour? The best way for us to do this is to go through the parable itself, and so let's walk through it. Verse 1, Jesus told his disciples. So you'll be familiar with the parables of Luke 15 that we looked at if you were here a couple of weeks ago. This trilogy of parables of a lost sheep, coin and son. The parable here in Luke 16 comes immediately after. There's no break in the parables. It seems to be happening at the same time. The parable of the lost sheep, coin and son, we know is told to the Pharisees who complained that Jesus welcomed sinners. But at the start of chapter 16, Luke wants us to know that the audience has switched. He's no longer speaking to the Pharisees, he's now addressing the disciples. Whenever you're reading the Bible, the audience is all important, because what you're going to say to a Christian is going to be very different from what you're going to say to a non-Christian. If you're telling Christians to live good lives and do good things, it's not to earn their salvation. They're Christians, they're followers of Jesus. You're telling them to live in such a way that's going to bring glory to God, in a way that you wouldn't say to non-Christians. So here he's talking to followers of Jesus. He's talking to his disciples. Verse 14, we're told that even though the Pharisees are not the audience, they're still eavesdropping on the parable. Verse 14, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this. The parable is directed at Jesus' followers, but clearly Jesus is speaking loud enough so that those lovers of money who needed to take these things to heart also heard. But this parable is about how to live as a disciple of Jesus. Verse 1 continues, a rich man had a manager. So I said when we were reading, the owner of the house would have employed servants to look after his possessions. So if you think of in the Old Testament Potiphar, who the slaves were taken to Potiphar's household, and Potiphar often left his household in charge of the servants that he put in place. Joseph was a slave there. It says Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his entire household and entrusted everything to his care. So what we've got here is sort of an equivalent to what Joseph was doing in Potiphar's household in this parable. So at the end of verse 1, the servant is accused, this one who's got to manage all of the master's possessions, is accused presumably by other servants or people who came into contact. Hearsay gets back to the boss. He's squandering, he's wasting your possessions. Which is interestingly the same word, a very unusual word, that is used a few verses ago of the prodigal son who squandered his father's possessions. And so clearly there are some links here moving into chapter 16. The servant is told to pack his bags in verse 2, so he's given his notice. We don't know how long that notice would have been. Imagine pretty quick. It seems to have been pretty quick, because when he calls in the debtors, he says, sit down and quickly change your contracts. So I'm about to lose my job. I'm going to pack my bags and go. So quickly, let's do it before I go. But the servant's now stuck. He's got no job. He's got two choices, because as a disgraced servant, he wouldn't be able to walk into somebody else's household and serve as a servant in somebody else's estate, because now he's got a black mark against his name. His CV does not look very good at this point, because he's been ousted from his previous job for wasting possessions. So he's pretty unlikely to get that job again. Right, I've got to find some other line of work. What am I going to do? I've got two choices: either menial work like digging, or I've got to beg. They're really the only two things I've got. Digging, so for example, you have these day labourers. You have the parable of the vineyard owner, and the master goes out into the marketplace, and you had what was essentially the lowest of the low, people who couldn't get any jobs, and they went out and said, come and work in my vineyard for a few hours and I'll pay you something for it. So I can do that. I can be a digger, which is the lowest job you could do, or I can beg. So I'm too proud to beg. I've just been working for a rich man, a position of status, and I was the head honcho over the estate. I don't want to beg. And he's a bit of a skinny fellow. He's been working in office jobs all of his life. So he says, I'm unlikely to make money digging. I'm too weak to dig. If I went out into the marketplace and waited for a vineyard owner to come out, he'd take one look at me, And my skinny frame, you look at the bulky other men in the marketplace and I get chosen last. So I'm not strong enough to get a job digging and I'm too proud to beg. So he comes up with a plan to improve his CV. He calls in all the people who owe the master money. Now it's against, and you can look this up in the Old Testament law, it's against the Jewish law to loan fellow Jews money and to charge them interest. So you read through Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy as well, and you'll see there that there's this big push against not charging interest against your fellow people. But some of the greedy moneylenders, which seems to be the case in Luke 16, found ways around those laws by sort of charging interest in terms of possessions and other things. This is probably what we see here. This is probably what these people owed. So what likely happens here is that the first debtor, and there'll be differences of opinions on exactly what's going on here, but the first debtor, he's got 450 gallons of olive oil. Depending on your translation, you might have different metrics for measuring these things. Obviously, these are ancient metrics that they've just converted into our various systems of measurements. He's got the equivalent of 450 gallons of olive oil, but he would have had to pay back 900. So you see here, he's got the equivalent of 900 gallons, but probably originally he borrowed 450 and would have been charged 100% interest, so now he owes 900. This is because olive oil had such a short shelf life, and so interest was always really high on oil. So you'd always have 100% interest on whatever you borrowed in terms of oil to pay back. So when the servant calls the man in who owes 900 gallons, he halves the debt. So he's probably taking off all of the interest. Likewise, wheat, which is the second person who comes in who owes wheat, would have come with 20% interest, somewhere between 20 and 25% interest, because wheat lasted a lot longer than oil, so the amount of interest you charge would have been a lot smaller, because it had a bigger shelf life. So when the servant reduces the debt of wheat, he reduces it by 20% from the 1,000 bushels to 800 bushels, or whatever measurement system you've got in your translation. He's taking off the interest, most likely. Why does he do that? Well, verse 4 tells us he does it so that he will be welcomed into someone else's house. Why? Why would he be welcomed into somebody else's house? Well, this man is a servant, who's more literally, he's a house servant. So he worked for these wealthy owners in their houses. So you'd have there's no good English equivalent, but imagine the lord of the manor in these stately homes. You get these big old stately homes that would have one day been functioning, of course, and they would have had all these servants and the managers in the household and the maids and the butlers and the cooks and all the rest of it. And you would work for the household, and then if you lost that job or moved on, you try to work for another household. And so when he loses his job, he wants to make a plan so that he will be welcomed into another house, so that he will get employment for another lord of the manor, another house owner. What he means is that he will find work in someone else. I'll be welcomed to someone else's house, into another job, in other words. I'm going to improve my CV by doing this. So you imagine the situation. You've got a huge amount of oil or wheat that you owe, and you're never going to be able to pay off your debt. You're being charged 100% interest on the oil, or 20% interest on the wheat. You're never going to be able to pay that back. It's a lifelong loan. You hear about these students coming out of university with these ridiculous loans that they'll never be able to pay off. Well, this is the situation of some of these debtors. But then out of the blue, the manager, who's in charge of all these contracts, he calls you in and says, we're going to renegotiate your contracts. I'm going to halve your debt. Now, if you're one of the debtors, how would that make you feel? Pretty great, right? This is like having your credit card bill just wiped away. And the man who halved your debt would suddenly be your best friend, wouldn't he? Now he's in your good books. Oh, this man, he's reduced all my debt. How wonderful. They would think, what a generous, kind, thoughtful person this manager is. A few days later, you hear, oh, that man's lost his job. And he comes knocking at your door. And he says, remember me? He says, I'm the one who halved your debt. I'm the one who got you out of that terrible loan and with all that massive interest. And they would welcome him into their homes with open arms. Well, because they owe this man, don't they? They owe him for the position he's put them in. Come and have a job in my house. We'll treat you well. And so instead of these people being in debt to the master, they're now indebted to this man and his kindness. It's clever, isn't it? And when the master of the house finds out the servant's plan in verse 8, Jesus tells us that the master will say, that was a smart thing to do. What a clever, shrewd, astute servant he was. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly, verse 8. But notice, the master does not applaud the man's dishonesty. He applauds his cleverness and his business acumen. As one commentator puts it, there's a big difference between applauding a smart manager for being dishonest and applauding a dishonest manager for being smart. So in other words, he's appreciating the way he's been scammed. I once had you get these scams, somebody's talking about something about a scam this morning. You get these scams where people phoning you up or emailing you, trying to get you to hand over your bank details, whatever it might be. I had one that nearly convinced me once, that was so cleverly put together, and I nearly fell for it. But afterwards I thought, that was quite a clever scam. It nearly got my money off me. I appreciated the cleverness of the scam, no matter how dishonest and terrible it was. Now, there's a true story about a mother whose son was asking for a toy. They were going shopping, and the son, every time he went in a toy shop, was whining that he wanted a certain toy to be bought for him. But the mother wanted to teach him about saving up, about being responsible with your money, and about using it wisely. And so she said, I'm not going to buy you this toy. You're going to have to save up. You pocket money and you save it up over time, and you'll be able to buy this toy. Now, immediately the son reached into his mouth, grabbed one of his loose teeth, baby teeth, and pulled it out. He gave it to his mother, and he said, well, that should cover it. You can get your money back off the tooth fairy next time you see him. Now, the mother bought the son the toy, because although she didn't approve of the son's action, she thought, well, that was really quite clever, wasn't it? That was shrewd. There's a similar thing kind of going on here to a certain extent. There's been a lot of discussion over this verse. So it's largely centered around the question, well, how could Jesus speak well of a dishonest manager? Even if Jesus is praising the man's cleverness rather than his dishonesty, his cleverness still involved being dishonest. How can Jesus have commended dishonesty, even if it was a means to an end? Well, I think that misses the point. It's not Jesus who praises the man here, it's the master of the house in the parable. And the master does not represent Jesus. He simply represents the people of this world and the way that they do their business. So if you read in verse 8 and the second half of verse 8, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than Christians are, people of the light. So he's saying, look, this is the way the world works, this is the way people deal with their money. They're clever with it, they're smart with it because they want more money, they're after more money. He's simply saying that the people of this world are clever, and they're admired for it. They're admired for their business acumen. Jesus is not using this as a model for how we should behave. Indeed, elsewhere Jesus says that we should be shrewd. We should be as shrewd as snakes, Jesus says, and yet as innocent as doves. We ought to be shrewd, we ought to be wise like the man in the parable, but unlike him, we ought to be as innocent as doves. We ought to be honest. So the point Jesus is making is non-Christians are often wise when it comes to taking care of themselves, taking care of their money. It's very clever the way this servant takes care of his future and therefore his employment and therefore his income by the way that he acts. In fact, Jesus says, non-Christians are often a lot better at this than Christians are. Verse 8, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kinds than the people of light. But Jesus is not saying, therefore we ought to be more like them. Instead, he's creating a contrast. He's saying, I believe, non-Christians work hard to gain money, to gain employment, to gain friends, even though they only have hope for this world. Their employment will only last a few years. The friends they gain will only last for this life. The money they get will only last for this life. And yet they work really hard at gaining things that will only last for a few years or decades. So if the people of this world are keen to apply their wisdom for temporary things, for earthly things, then shouldn't the followers of Jesus, the people of the light, use their wisdom and their cleverness for eternal purposes, for things that will last? Now, some of us have perhaps been very impressed with the way that Jehovah's Witnesses work so hard at their faith, or the way Muslims work hard at their faith, and yet we believe that they are living a lie, that they don't have the truth. And we think, well, how much harder, how much more zealous should we be knowing that we have the truth than these people who are deceived in their understanding? They put us to shame sometimes. This is what Jesus is saying. Look, the people of this world sometimes put us to shame because they put so much effort in. They work hard at things that aren't going to last. How are we going to work hard for things that will? So verse 9 says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. This is how we should live. So that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus is saying that in the light of what the servant has done. So that's a comparison, a contrast to what the servant has done. He's saying the manager in the parable used his wealth to make friends. That's what he did. He used his wealth to make friends in his next job, friends in other households, these debtors. So that when his wealth was gone, when he was fired, he would be welcomed into someone else's dwelling. He would be welcomed into employment in somebody else's house. So, but that's not what we're to do. We're to use what we have for eternal purposes. We have eternal friends to make. We have eternal dwellings to enjoy. We have eternal service for an eternal master. Just as the shrewd manager uses money to gain friends with potential employers, so we should use what we have to gain friends. Well, what does that mean? That we're to gain? It sounds like an odd way of phrasing it. I think it simply means this, that we're to use what we have to bless other people. We're to think about the way in which we use our money and our possessions for eternal purposes, to bless others, to be kind, to show the kind of love Christ showed, to show friendliness to other people, to use it for the gospel, to use it for his kingdom, to use it for his glory, to use it to display Christian characteristics of generosity and sacrifice and kindness and friendliness, because one day we will be welcomed into eternal dwellings when all of our worldly wealth is gone. Not temporary dwellings, not temporary employment like the man in this parable, but an eternal dwelling and an eternal service of an eternal kingdom. And if we use our money for eternal purposes, then maybe God would even choose to use the money that we give to bring others into that kingdom as well, eternal friends, if you like. As for the rest of the verses here, let me just briefly touch on the rest of the verses that follow on from this parable. So on face value, it seems like these verses are a bit of a mishmash of teachings related to money, and some have questioned whether Jesus said this at this time or whether just Luke's sort of collating a number of sayings on money to include them with the parable. I don't think that's the case. We don't have time to explore the way it all fits together, but I want to draw your attention to 3 descriptions of money in these verses, because money is described in 3 ways in this passage that help us understand the way Jesus wants us to think about our worldly wealth, okay? And the first is that worldly wealth. In verse 9, it's also in verse 11. Verse 9, worldly wealth, we should use our worldly wealth to gain friends. Worldly wealth does not mean our ill-gotten gains. It doesn't mean dishonest money. It's not worldly in that sense. It simply means things that we acquire in the course of our lives. The wealth that belongs to our lives in this world. It's wealth that lasts only as long as the world lasts. There was a story of a cruise ship that sank, and there was a steward on board, an American steward, who panicked when she saw that the ship was going down, and so she ran around her little cabin and tried to collect up all the money that she'd earned working on the cruise ship, and she stuffed all of these coins into her apron as the ship was going down, and then jumped overboard. And of course, what happened? She hit the waves and sank to her death because of the amount of money that she had in her pockets. Literally, she was killed by her worldly wealth. When I was younger, I used to hear the saying a lot, there's no pockets in shrouds. Do people still say that? No pockets in shrouds. You can't take it with you. It's worldly wealth. It lasts only for a short time. Jesus repeats worldly wealth in verse 11, and there he compares it to true riches, riches that will last, riches that are for true purposes. Worldly wealth is not true riches, is it? It comes for a time and then it fades very quickly. Becoming a Christian is like swapping worldly wealth for eternal wealth, for true riches. In fact, we hear that in the Sermon on the Mount, don't we, in Matthew, where Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. So it's comparing worldly wealth to true wealth. There was an old Puritan minister who, say old Puritan, not many new Puritans, I suppose. An old Puritan scholar who said, he was once rich earlier in life, but he became very poor very suddenly. And he reflected on the two parts of his life. And he said the difference between being wealthy and being poor was like this. He said, when I was rich, I found God in all. I found God in all the money I was given. He says, but now that I'm poor, I find all in God. He said, and the latter is greater than the former. It's worldly wealth swapped for true riches. The second thing we're told that money is described as here is in verse 10. It's described as, worldly wealth is described as very little. Verse 10, whoever can be trusted with very little, in other words, worldly wealth, can be trusted with much, eternal wealth. Whoever's dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So another way of describing the wealth of this world, the money that we have, is very little. It's wonderful to think that the billionaires of this world have very little compared to the simplest and youngest and frailest Christian who has much by comparison. Remember what Jesus said to the rich young ruler. In fact, that's the point of the rich young ruler. Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Get rid of your very little, and you'll have very much. We're told he went away sad because he had great wealth, but what he failed to realize is that his wealth he had was very little compared to the treasures of heaven he would have received had he followed Jesus. And that's what Jesus said to his disciples at the end of that passage, which comes up in Luke. You'll see in Luke's gospel close to this. He said, truly I tell you, no one who has left homes or brothers or sisters or mothers or father or children or fields, possessions, for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, fields, along with persecutions, but in the age to come, eternal life. You give up your very little, and you'll gain 100 times what you give up. So this world's riches are rightly called very little when compared with what God has in store for us. Recently heard a minister say that if you doubt God's riches are greater than this world's riches, just remember that picture in Revelation. In Revelation, heaven is pictured as having these streets paved with gold. In other words, gold is like tarmac to God. Gold's everything to people, isn't it? It's the highest form of wealth, and yet the Bible says, it's just like tarmac to God. Just plain, just ordinary compared to the wealth he has. As the great John Calvin once said, all the wealth of this world is nothing but a heap of clay. It's very little. The third thing that money is described as is in verse 12. It's described as, our earthly possessions are described as somebody else's property. Is that in verse 12? In the parable, the steward owned nothing, did he? The wealth that he had was given to him to look after by his master. Now that's true of all of us. Our worldly wealth, our very little, is not our own. It is something from God. Right? God is the giver of all good things, including worldly things like that can be used in God's kingdom for good. It's given by God. There's a story of a beggar who was passed by a lady, and he asked her for money, and she threw him a coin. It was just a small coin, a shilling or something like that. I don't know what a shilling is, to be honest with you, but I assume it's a fairly small coin. I'm going to get some funny looks now when I say.
5 new pence.
Is it 5 new pence? Which is probably a bit more back then, wasn't it? But yes, she throws him this coin, and as she throws him the coin, she said to the beggar, "That's more than God ever gave me." And the beggar says, "What do you mean by that?" He sees the way she's dressed. He says, "Clearly God's given you very much." "No," she said. "Nothing is given to me. It's only loaned to me by God to use for him. All I have is loaned." That's true, isn't it? In life, all that we have is loaned to us by God for 70, 80, 90 years, however long God gives us on this earth. As Charles Spurgeon, the Baptist preacher, once put it, we own nothing except our own sin. The only thing that we own is our own sin. Everything else is a gift to us from God. So the way that we use our wealth is important, because it's someone else's money. It's someone else's possessions. It's God's. Perhaps we don't like to talk about money much in church. Perhaps we should do more than we do. We are faced with a culture of greed and a culture that's consumed with the love of money, and we must make sure, because it's so easy, that we don't get dragged into that position. As a church, you never want to be known as being money-grabbing and was talking about money, because of the bad reputation the church has had at times in the past. And so, not this church, but the church as a whole, Christianity. And you never want to get dragged into that, but perhaps we should talk about money more. There's one preacher who said this. He said, you see, living as a Christian, if we live practically as a Christian, practically our Christian living will show itself in two books, the diary and the checkbook. Right? It will affect the way that we live, the way that we spend our time, the diary, and it will affect our checkbook. The checkbooks are rather outdated now, aren't they? But it will affect the way that we use our debit card. It will affect the way that we use the money that we are given. So we must challenge ourselves. Are we shrewd in using what we have for God's kingdom? And how do we use our worldly wealth, our very little? How do we use somebody else's possessions given to us by God for eternal purposes? We'll close there, and please do ask questions afterwards. We'll have a think about this if you're puzzled by some of the things, or you can shed some extra light on it. That'd be lovely. But we're going to sing a song that picks up some of those themes, which is Take My Life, Let It Be, which is 850 in Praise Hymn Book. And as you'll know, one of the verses speaks about our silver and our gold, not a mite would I withhold. Take my mind that I may use every power as you shall choose. We'll stand to sing 850 together.